A cursed forest with a very real reputation for causing people to go insane. A weathered old lighthouse roamed by the restless spirits of those lost to tragedy. And a former prison site where ghostly inmates still serve out their sentences from beyond the grave. Await on this tour of some of Connecticut's most haunted places. Let's dive right in. Kicking off this journey, our first haunt has us scouting the eastern shores of Connecticut and braving a trip to the weathered New London Ledge Light. The New London Ledge Light, which sits just off the coast of Groton, Connecticut, is a 58-foot-tall historic navigational aid that's grown into a popular destination for tourists, historians, and sightseers, and its bounds are shrouded in a number of chilling ghost stories and tales of paranormal encounters. Historically, in 1903, lobbying for the lighthouse would begin, after the Lighthouse Board recommended that a navigational aid was required on the point in order to allow for safe entrance and exit to and from the harbor, which was, might I add, absolutely jam-packed with fun little shoals, ledges, reefs, rocks, and a bunch of other dangerous things that pretty much spelled death for passing vessels. And by 1909, the tower was finished. Boasting a fourth-order Fresnel lens and its signature 3 white flashes followed by a red flash every 30 seconds, the tower was an instant icon. Life for keepers on the isolated little block, however, was monotonous, and at times, even dangerous, as the light and its adjacent stretch of shoreline were hot zones for lashback from some pretty massive hurricanes, such as the hurricane of September 21st, 1938, when then lightkeeper Howard Beebe reported watching as the torrent washed out everything visible. The last civilian keeper, William Ivan Clark, would depart from the light in 1959, after which it was run by crews of 3 for a time, before, in 1987, and like many of its peers, it was fully automated. In 1990, the light was honored on the National Register of Historic Places, and into the present, it remains an icon of Connecticut and an ever-popular travel destination offering a number of touring options and events each and every year. And of its many, many visitors, a good number of those who have braved the New London Ledge Light have reported encounters with the otherworldly. Phantom bootsteps are heard up and down the stairs, the smell of tobacco smoke is often detected wafting without source, and various doors have a habit of opening and closing on their own. Now, as number 5 on this countdown, and for those of you that have been following me for a while, and have incidentally also seen some of the horrific constructs that I've covered in the past, this site isn't really what I'd call crazy haunted. But out of all the possible locations I could have picked, it is here for a reason. Its local lore and the frequency of ghostly encounters reported within are just plain uncanny. Now, most of the activity on site has been attributed to the spirit of a former keeper from the 1920s or 30s that everyone has since dubbed Ernie. As the story goes, Ernie's wife chose to stay on shore while he tended the light, and during one of his stays out over the ocean, his beloved wife ended up running away with the captain of the Block Island ferry. After drinking himself into a stupor, and out of both desperation and depression, Ernie then climbed to the top of the tower before throwing himself over. His body was never recovered, and to date, it's believed his restless spirit wanders the light, condemned forever to the job that took everything from him. Along with odd happenings across the property, more disturbingly, both passing vessels and those who have been inside the light after dark have also reported horrifying instances in which they spot a body falling from high above and rush to whatever window or ledge they saw it fall by, only to find the waters below undisturbed. Our second haunt takes us to the central heartland of the state and on a tour through the iconic Connecticut state capitol. The Connecticut State Capitol, which is placed in the center of Hartford, is a historic landmark, popular tourist stop, and center of government for the state of Connecticut that's bounds, over their many, many years, have earned a reputation for surprisingly frequent reports of supernatural activity. Historically, predating construction of our modern capital, in 1792, an initial state house was constructed in Hartford, and another was later built in New Haven, so that meetings between the General Assembly could be hosted in both communities. Following the Civil War, however, both cities realized that only one could stand as capital, and both competed, with Hartford eventually winning out. Following the bustling city's selection as capital, the General Assembly would meet and would authorize a $1 million project aimed at the creation of a new center of government. Our current Capitol building would be completed in 1878 and at more than double the original budget, at a nearly even $2.5 million. The new construct was styled in Eastlake with French Gothic Revival influences and was opened for the January 1879 session of the General Assembly of Connecticut. This new capitol was so impressive, in fact, that the ever-prestigious publication, the New York Times, would describe it as, "A vast mass of white marble is this imposing structure, and in the dazzling sunshine of a New England summer noon, sparkles like a fairy palace of frostwork." Notably, later the same year, in September, around 10,000 Connecticut vets would form a procession and would march through the streets and up to the Capitol, where they would deposit 30 regimental flags in honor of the Civil War. Through its lengthy existence, the building would suffer crowding issues as populations expanded over the following century. However, the introduction of various partitions and hot routes would enable business to resume as usual, albeit at a major detraction from the site's original plan and layout. And eventually, additional civic buildings would be constructed to reduce strain on the Capitol. In 1970, the aged construct was added to the National Register of Historic Places and was dedicated a National Historic Landmark. And in 1979, and a decade later in 89, the property would welcome a number of restorations and renovations. In the present, the old building still acts as the state capitol and is popular not just amongst the politicians who work there, but also with historians and sightseers. And though during the day the Capitol presents itself as a place of morals and just politics, after nightfall, those who have stayed just a bit too late have told of a darker layer, one wrought with chilling paranormal activity. Reported all across Capitol grounds are instances of light switches flicking on and off by themselves, of extreme cold patches isolated to specific locations, and that seemingly move or even follow people, and of disembodied footsteps and chatter heard at all hours, usually from vacant rooms or hallways. Easily the most famous Capitol ghost story is tied to former Governor William Buckingham, who tragically passed on a few years before the building was ever completed, and whose likeness is displayed by a memorial statue that stands right near the west entrance. Though he never saw the project finished, Buckingham toured the site many times, and through the years, many have told of run-ins with a cheery man matching his description, who is there one minute and gone the next. Additionally, many tell his favorite room is 324, for whatever reason, where staff have documented objects that move on their own, and weird malfunctions with personal electronics. Also reported across the property, and namely by night staff, are shadowy figures that lurk about, a strange wailing call that echoes through the building, and encounters with a ghostly little girl that always peeks from around corners or across cluttered areas, and that's always gone upon closer inspection. Marking the midpoint on this chilling adventure, our third haunt lands us in south central Connecticut and has us hiking the foreboding and overgrown trails surrounding the infamous Devil's Hopyard. The Devil's Hopyard, which is placed out of East Haddam, Connecticut, is an eerily beautiful forest expanse encompassing a large area around 8 Mile River and Chapman Falls. That's bounds have long attracted hikers and campers, and more recently, paranormal investigators and dark tourists as well, due to their purported ties to the King of Hell himself, Lucifer. Historically, predating settlement of this region, lands now holding the Hopyard were once inhabited by the Wangunks, the Nahantics, and the Mohegans, not to be confused with Mohicans, and their people flourished beneath the lush canopies on ready supplies of game, fresh water, fish, stone, and wood. Beginning in the mid-1600s, European settlers would begin purchasing land from local tribes. In 1662, what would one day become East Haddam was purchased for just 30 coats, and by the 1680s, several homesteads had sprouted up near. Now, the area around the falls themselves was actually pretty unfarmable. The soil layer was thin, and as such, the grove surrounding Chapman Falls remained relatively undeveloped, as the small local community instead focused on the timber trade and hunting. So, like many of our country's other early towns, families around 8 Mile River were namely all Puritan, and as such, their religious views were pretty fierce. One thing that seemingly always haunted the Puritan faith was the belief that they always had to be on the lookout for the devil, and that he could be hiding anywhere, even in the most beautiful of places. Now, while none of this next part is certain, and nothing has really ever been proven, 3 stories slowly formed around Chapman Falls, which, incidentally, boasts some beautifully strange rock formations that create deep and swirling pools in the rocks. So to kick things off, it was claimed that someone ran a hopyard near, possibly a man by the name of Dibble. And over time, Dibble's hopyard was called the Devil's Hopyard instead. Sort of a bad game of telephone, if you will. Another bit of lore tells that the pothole-like formations surrounding the falls were actually created by the devil himself, after he accidentally got his tail wet and stamped the ground in a rage. A final, very popular legend tells of times that people have arrived to the falls, especially at night, and especially during important lunar phases, seasonal changes, and the like, to find none other than old Satan himself perched atop them, playing a violin, as the witches of Haddam stir hell broth for a charm of powerful trouble, in the natural cauldrons formed from the rocks below. Later into its history, the Hopyard would play host to a 1775 attack by the Sons of Liberty, who tarred and feathered a local mill owner and his brother before destroying their mill and rolling their millstone down a hill, where it actually still sits to this day. Until 1890, 8 Mile River would power mill operations, after which, by 1919 and following raised awareness by Colchester resident A.G. Willard, who stated that she feared logging would soon destroy the beauty of the area, the expanse was quickly picked up as a state park, and would undergo a multitude of projects under the Civilian Conservation Corps that resulted in new trails, restructuring of various embankments, river maintenance, and much, much more. In the present, the Devil's Hopyard remains open to the public, and every year, droves of campers, hikers, and curious tourists flood the Hopyard. And chillingly, a slew of them return with terrifying stories of supernatural encounters throughout the woods, including accounts of strange mists that descend upon the Hopyard alone on otherwise clear days, of disembodied whispers and demonic voices heard from the darkness, and of shadowy figures that lurk in the thickets of the forest. One of the eerier stories I've personally heard regarding this particular spot tells of a group of friends who were driving a dirt road through the area at night sometime in the early 1990s, when all of a sudden, something shot out of the nearby forest with blinding speed and slammed into their car with such force it shook the rig, caused everyone to scream, and resulted in the driver speeding off. Lastly, several parties have reported instances of their well-maintained vehicles refusing to start. Many visitors have told of feeling a constant, unnerving feeling not dissimilar to that of being watched. And on moonlit nights, even in modern times, some have told of sighting the devil himself atop the falls, and his gathering of witches and all manner of demons down below. And on to number 4, which has us traveling all the way up to the northern border of the state and delving into the depths of the old Newgate Prison. The old Newgate Prison, which is located in East Granby, Connecticut, is a former correctional facility turned museum and archaeological preserve. That's bounds are infinitely popular amongst locals, tourists, historians, school teachers, professors, and more, and that totes a sinister reputation for its purported hauntings and ghostly manifestations. Historically, documentation from the era suggests that sometime around 1705, copper ore was discovered in the western side of Talcott Mountain, which was, at the time, part of Simsbury, and by 1707, construction of a mining operation had been started, in which crews dug directly down into the earth, and then out horizontally to form tunnels at various levels. In 1709, a trio of men started a local Woodbridge mining company aimed at mining some of the region's copper, after which they would actually invite the people of Simsbury to participate in the smelting process. The amateur bars that were produced from this experiment were then shipped off into British hands. However, the British didn't have any furnaces capable of extracting metals in the way that were needed for this amateur work, so ultimately, this venture failed. Later, however, in 1714, another group, spearheaded by a member of the original company's clergy, would lease the area from the town and would then resurrect the mine. But instead of amateurs, new owners would contract professional miners to extract ores, after which their yield was shipped off to England for processing. Despite their best efforts, however, various bans and regulations would make mining this copper unprofitable, and over the years, the trade would slowly dwindle out, and one by one, operations through the area were left abandoned. Much later, in 1773, the Connecticut General Assembly began the search for a central prison to house its convicts, and the unsuccessful mine with its spaghetti bowl of underground passageways came into consideration. Ultimately, this site would be selected, after which the colony would purchase the remainder of the lease and would construct new walls underground, by which to detain prisoners in what was essentially an inescapable tomb with only one entrance and exit. Shortly thereafter, legislature would approach local tavern owner John Vietz and would offer him a position as prison keeper, which he would accept. Through the American Revolution, the prison would begin holding POWs, and their treatment was nothing less than monstrous. With over 100 prisoners jammed into confined spaces, air was limited. There was no natural light, no opportunities to bathe, and all facilities were shared. Amongst those British who had heard of the prison, it had earned an adequate moniker: Hell. Prisoners at Newgate were forced to work in iron chains manufacturing nails from 4 a.m. to 4 p.m., were whipped as punishment, and were sent to bed on musty piles of hay. And needless to say, both disease and death were common. Escape attempts occurred in both the spring of 1776, when a group of prisoners tried to burn down a wooden door and ended up killing one of their own with smoke inhalation, and again in 1781, when a group of prisoners overpowered staff, locked them up, and fled the scene. And when all was said and done, it was estimated that nearly half of the inmates at Newgate either absconded or escaped at some capacity or another. Newgate would continue to operate until 1827, when it was finally closed down following the construction of Wethersfield State Prison. Through the following decades, several attempts were made to reactivate the mines nearby. However, all of these ventures failed, and afterwards, the mines were purchased by private owners, and candlelight tours of the prison were started. In 1968, the state would acquire the site. In 1970, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places, and more recently, from 2009 to 2018, the expanse was closed to the public for repairs. In the present, Old Newgate remains open to the public and hosts all manner of events, many of which that center around either September or October, namely Halloween. Not in the least surprising, the Old Newgate Prison is surrounded by a wealth of local ghost stories, and those who have braved its bounds have told of phantom footsteps heard from the tunnels, of the clanging of chains that emanate from thin air, and of a constant unease, as if someone or something is always following, just behind in the darkness. One of the most famous ghost stories surrounding the prison tells of a tour guide that once worked the attraction, and who loved his job and the history surrounding the old lockup. As some claim it, this tour guide worked the prison for many years until he grew old and passed on. Following his death, however, staff members were confused when visitors continued to leave compliments for a tour guide fitting the deceased's description. And over the years, it was discovered that all of these well wishes were, in fact, directed at a ghost. To this day, the ghostly tour guide has been known to appear from time to time, and always to the unsuspecting, leading entire parties from room to room before, in the blink of an eye or the quick turn of a head, he's suddenly just gone. Also reported throughout the prison are chilling stories of disembodied moans, cries, and pleading that are believed to be echoes from those who perished within the dements, and several have told of being grabbed roughly or even shoved by invisible hands. Lastly, shortly into the aforementioned prison keeper Viet's tenure, the site would receive its first prisoner, being one John Hinson, who was somewhat of a regular in the regional lockups, and who'd just been sentenced to 10 long years for burglary. One winter night, however, during a particularly bad snowstorm, Vietz went down to the lockup to find that Hinson, along with all of his stuff, had vanished. As it turned out, a woman, likely a love interest, had trekked miles through deep snow with 100 feet of rope and had lowered it down the entrance, which allowed the burglar to climb to freedom. To this day, when it snows, and often after dark, visitors have told of footprints appearing out of nowhere and of the ghostly sounds of Henson's spirit grunting as it relives what was probably the most important climb of his life. Saving the spookiest for last, our fifth and final hunt shoots us off into the northwestern wilderness of Connecticut and has us combating madness itself within the suffocating confines of the Dark Entry Forest. The Dark Entry Forest, which, let's just point out, is a really eerie name, and which also contains the remnants of the 18th century settlement of Dudleytown, is located in Litchfield County in Connecticut and is comprised of 750 privately owned acres that it's claimed are off limits to the public purely for conservation reasons, which, if you know anything about this place, is just a little suspicious. You see, even though it's long since been closed off to the public, local legends tied to the Dark Entry Forest are so terrifyingly real that they're still infamous to this day. And honestly, guys, while there are a lot of different places in the state that I could have picked as most haunted for this particular journey, to put it bluntly, this is one of my favorites, and its stories are ridiculously freaking creepy. So here it goes. Historically, predating settlement, the region that our present-day forest was contained within played home to a number of native tribes, including the Paugussett and Shattuck nations, and it actually sat right on the borderlands between their tribes. As such, while it isn't believed to have hosted any formal settlements, it is suspected that this particular area was utilized as what else but a burial ground. Now later, it's believed that when Dudleytown was founded circa the 1740s, that settlers then disturbed this burial ground, which, as we all know from pretty much every horror flick out there, is just terrible. Rewind just a skosh though. To clarify, Dudleytown wasn't actually a town at all. In fact, it was just an extension of Cornwall. In particular, a few parcels that were settled by a family by the name of Dudley. So when we're talking about Dudleytown, just imagine a major homestead and probably a handful of other families spread throughout this dense and unnecessarily dark woodland. Over the following years, the landscape would be transformed from forest into farmlands as locals attempted to carve out a living, and their economy would be namely based off of lumber. Unfortunately, however, a series of tragedies, cough cough, would transpire, and as more fertile lands in the Midwest opened up, the community would at first dwindle and eventually dry out. In 1924, a large section of lands, including our aforementioned cursed woodlands and the remnants of Dudleytown, would be purchased by the Dark Entry Forest Association and would be closed off to the public, with the corporation stating, and I quote, "The society is planned to promote forestation, to run a wood mill, to promote conservation of bird, animal, and wildflower life, and to afford a playground for you and your children and your children's children." Soon after this acquisition, the property's new owners would plant thousands of trees, and the expanse would quickly take on a twisted and overgrown look. Through the 1930s, New York's Skid River Club would use the park as a place for horseback riding and canoeing in the summers, and conversely, for skiing in the winters. And this new popular destination would welcome a number of events. Through its long history, the forest and what little remains of Dudleytown has gone through seasons of being opened and then closing back down and then opening back up once more. In the present, unfortunately, it is closed to the public. However, opportunities for visitors to hike its bounds do occasionally present themselves. Regardless, this limitation has done little to stop paranormal investigators, tourists, and history buffs from getting as close to the forest as they possibly can, from skirting its border, or from trying to catch a glimpse of what's claimed to lay within. Now brace yourselves, because unlike a lot of locations I cover that are surrounded by mere legends, Probably the most perturbing part of the ghost stories here is that they're actual history. See, way back when, in the 1700s, when the land was originally sold to the family, it was sold to Gideon Dudley, who was the first Dudley to acquire the deed. Now, as it's told, Gideon was a descendant of Edmund Dudley, who, in 1510, was beheaded for treason against King Henry VIII, and it's said that a curse was placed upon him and the rest of his family line. Later, his son John Dudley would be executed during the reign of Lady Jane Grey, right alongside John's own son, Guilford, who was initially supposed to marry Lady Grey until she was overthrown, and all three were sentenced to death together. Following all the death, the family slowly dwindled down until it was just Gideon and his brothers Abiel and Barzillai, who all ended up moving to America in hopes of finding a different fortune. As the town formed, however, it became apparent that whatever curse followed their bloodline didn't recognize earthly borders, and an indescribable shadow overtook the land. Crops seemingly failed at an abnormal rate, and some of the populace began talking of ghosts, demons, and even strange robed creatures that emerged from the forest after dark. To make matters worse, hand in hand with all of this madness was, actual madness, and I'm not kidding there. Literally around 80% of Dudleytown's populace actually went insane over time. The first purported victim of the Dudley curse was Nathaniel Carter and his family. As it's told, in the 1750s or 60s, the Carters were overcome by a strange illness, and after months of torment, they decided to move away from the town to Delaware, into the wilderness, where Nathaniel, his wife, and infant child were all slaughtered by native tribe members, while his 3 remaining children were abducted and taken to Canada for ransom. Abiel Dudley, a founding member of the community and Gideon's brother, would suffer from an odd dementia. In 1792, their friend Gershon Hollister would fall to his death in a freak barn building accident. William Tanner, whose barn was being built, would go mad. In 1804, a Sarah Faye Swift would be struck by lightning on the front porch of her home. And following her death, her husband, Revolutionary War hero General Herman Swift, would also lose his mind. As a cherry on top of this already fairly diabolical cake, possibly the eeriest blow to the community came in 1901. At this time, the population of the town had dwindled to nearly nothing. However, several families remained, including one John Patrick Brophy and his kin. Now, all within the span of a few months, Brophy's wife died of consumption. Then, after the funeral, his 2 children, as if in a trance, walked out into the forest and were never seen again. And finally, following his loss of, everything, one night, Brophy himself went suddenly silent and without saying a word, also walked out into the forest. And that's where his story ends. Lastly, after pretty much everyone had either died or moved away, and around the same time the Brophy's lives were crashing down around them, one Dr. William Clark and wife Harriet would move to Cornwall and would fall in love with Dudleytown in particular and its surrounding forest. They would purchase around 1,000 acres and would set to work on the construction of a summer vacation home, which they would visit off and on over the years. One summer weekend, however, Dr. Clark would be called away to New York on an emergency, with Harriet choosing to stay behind. And when he returned, just like it had with so many others, the curse had claimed Harriet's mind. Clark's wife was suddenly irrational, scared, incoherent, but one thing she kept mentioning for certain was that there were creatures that came from the forest at night. Sadly, Harriet would take her own life shortly after. While the good doctor was likely destroyed by this tragedy, he would maintain the house over the years, would eventually fall back into love and remarry, and would even return in 1930 and would stay for a time while his permanent residence was completed nearby. However, this is where things get even weirder. In 1924, the doc, his wife, and a handful of other doctors and friends would form what they called the Dark Entry Forest Association, which has highly regulated entry to these woodlands ever since. And they would hold their first meeting 2 years later with 41 dedicated members. Now guys, while I, like so many others before me, am inclined to say all of these incidents are probably just coincidences, and that a lot of other buildings out there boast crazy histories as well, you have to admit this one's a little weird. You have dozens of people losing their minds centuries apart in a populace that's not really that big, and unassociated parties talking about strange creatures that descend upon the land after dark. And then you have this association founded from doctors that purchase the property to keep people out. Ultimately, what you choose to believe in is up to you, but some of this math's not adding up. In modern times, those who have had the privilege of entering the forest, or for that matter, even those who have simply gotten too close, have reported a mess of chilling phenomena, including strange dizzy spells that some describe as dangerously euphoric, instances in which paths seemingly change or trees twist, resulting in parties becoming disoriented or lost, and accounts of missing chunks of time spanning anywhere from a few minutes to entire days that can't be rationalized. Additionally, within the forest, cellular devices and flashlights have a habit of malfunctioning at the worst times. Several have told of their well-maintained vehicles refusing to start, and even now, stories emerge of tall, hunched-over forms that move beyond the tree line, watching our world silently from the shadows. Their intentions, still a mystery. And there you have it. Thanks for joining me on this adventure through some of Connecticut's most haunted places. If you enjoyed hearing my histories and ghost stories, subscribe to my channel. Throw this upload a like, and share me with anyone and everyone you think might enjoy a good scare. I'll see you all next time, and thanks again.